Some are born with light in their eyes. Others learn to dim it to avoid disturbing others. You were the bright child, the one people pointed at and said, "They're going far. They'll be someone. They're different." You grew up being told you carried a future, and you believed it. But somewhere along the way, time passed, and you didn't become what they promised. Now every old compliment echoes like an accusation. You feel ashamed for not becoming who they expected. Worse, you feel like a burden, an emotional, social, maybe even familial weight. The promise became a debt, and every day is an attempt to repay it with performance, silence, or self-abandonment. This video is not about motivation. It's about identity grief, about confronting the space between who you were and who you never got to be. And finally, transmuting guilt into freedom. Maybe you think it's your fault, that you didn't try hard enough, made the wrong choices, sabotaged yourself. But that comfortable explanation hides the real trap. The truth is more perverse. The system worships potential, but only if it performs. From a young age, you were trained to be useful, admirable, efficient. But no one prepared you to fail, to pause, to just be human. You were a promise, but only as long as you delivered. The moment you stopped producing, they left you in the dark. The problem isn't you. It's the machine that only values potential that turns into profit. Picture a trophy shelf full of emptiness, each one representing an expectation never fulfilled. There lie the unexplored talents, the abandoned courses, the ideas you didn't pursue, not out of laziness, but paralyzing pressure. You carry so much weight from past expectations that you can't move. Every step feels like you're trying to prove you're still worth it. But here's the brutal truth. No one becomes whole by trying to prove they deserve what they already are. The light you had was hijacked by the obligation to be someone, and now you're trying to recover your glow through performance. Why now? Because the fracture is visible, the exhaustion is permanent, the comparison is constant, and the fear of never feeling light again has become routine. You live in a continuous grief for the version that never came to be, the future that never arrived, the light that turned into shame. But this grief needs to end, not to forget who you once hoped to be, but to release what still wants to emerge. You're not a burden. You're poisoned by an identity that confused value with output, and there's only one cure. Let go of the promise and be reborn without debt. And why me? Because I was that failed promise. I was the prodigy boy who became silence, the expectation that turned into shame, the hope that became rage. And only after collapsing did I understand. I didn't fail. I just tried to exist in a system that demands brilliance, but hates inner light. This channel is my recovery ritual, and this video is your call. Being a promise is a poisoned honor. You were praised not for who you were, but for who you might become. Every look of admiration came with a silent demand. Don't disappoint. Childhood became a stage of idealization. You learned that being loved meant being exceptional, and so, unknowingly, you made an invisible pact. You would only be worthy if you kept exceeding expectations, not for yourself, but for others. Not to live, but to justify the light they projected onto you. The promise became a persona, and over time that persona became a prison. You were never allowed to fail. Every mistake was a stain on the myth. Every moment of doubt felt like betrayal. And so, you learned to hide your falls. You masked failures, faked progress, smiled while sinking. Being a promise didn't give you freedom. It sentenced you to constant performance. The "you're special" turned into "you have to prove you're special" every day. And when the world stopped applauding, you didn't know what to do with the silence, because no one taught you how to exist without approval. That's the cruelest trick of the system. It turns your potential into emotional debt. The more promising you seemed, the heavier the burden. You were never taught how to process frustration, only how to outrun it through productivity. That's why today, when you're not delivering, you feel useless, because your identity was stitched with promises, and any pause feels like bankruptcy. But that's not failure. It's symbolic fatigue. You're not lazy. You're exhausted from carrying a persona that isn't allowed to rest, make mistakes, or simply be. Look inside. You're not ashamed of not doing more. You're ashamed of not sustaining the character others saw in you. That's why it hurts so much. Because the glow was real, but it was hijacked, turned into emotional currency to keep you obedient, admirable, productive. Being a promise became an emotional cage decorated with praise. And now you must choose. Keep performing to win back borrowed light, or begin the ritual of unbecoming the promise and rebirthing without debt. The system never wanted you to fulfill your potential. It only needed you to believe you were close. Promise is the perfect bait. It keeps you moving, always on the edge of greatness, but never whole. Because a fulfilled promise becomes a threat, autonomous, ungovernable, unconsumable. The system feeds on the almost successful, always promising, always improving, always buying. Almost buys more than achieved. It invests in courses, mentorships, appearances. It works over time. It spends to keep the narrative of evolution alive. The unfulfilled promise is emotional fuel for the machine. You became a display, a walking narrative of effort and almost. And that creates toxic hope, the kind that paralyzes more than it propels. You live in the anxiety of becoming someone, and the world profits from that. Every product that promises to unlock your potential is another symbolic shackle. Failure is never allowed, only postponed. And so, you become an eternal project, always preparing, always optimizing, never resting. Because the system teaches, only those who arrive can rest, and you, the promise, never arrive. The cruelest part? The more promising you once were, the more isolated you feel when you don't make it. No one wants to look at the bright kid who didn't shine. The failed promise makes people uncomfortable because it exposes the collective lie. That talent is enough, that effort always wins, that everyone has a fair shot. Your fall is too honest, so they ignore you, silence you, or sell you quick fixes. They preach resilience, but give no structure. They say, don't give up, while draining you until you collapse. A broken promise becomes a ghost, and the system pretends not to see. But here's the hidden truth: your real light doesn't serve the world as it is. The system has no place for whole people. It needs fragments, functions. It needs you to be useful, not complete. That's why it hijacked your brilliance and broke it into tasks, careers, goals, and debts. Your pain today is proof that your soul is still alive, still sensing it was meant for more. And that pain can be transmuted. Not to return to the stage, but to rebuild a self that no longer owes anyone anything. There comes a moment when the promise dies. Not with a crash, but with silence. You wake up and realize you no longer have the strength to fake it. That the future projected onto you no longer inspires. It suffocates. That the plans, once full of pride, now taste like shame. Even old compliments begin to sound like mockery, and you no longer know if you were gifted or just good at matching others' expectations. This death is invisible to the world, but it detonates your inner life. Because when the promise dies, so does the reason you thought you deserved to exist. This is where many get lost. Without the identity of the one who's going to make it, you feel like no one. You don't know what to say, what to want, what to chase. Ambition dies, desire evaporates, drive dissolves. Not from laziness, but from symbolic collapse. You were trained to function under expectation. Now without it, everything feels meaningless. But that emptiness is not an end. It's a portal. The old identity must crumble for something real to emerge. And that something won't be built on goals, applause, or approval. It will be rooted in presence. Here you face the hardest truth. The promise you were was never about you. It was projection, a collective fantasy etched onto your skin. Its death is your chance to be born for the first time, not as an expectation, but as an individual. But that demands grief. Deep, radical, unsentimental grief. You must bury the persona who tried to please everyone. Accept that you may never become what they hoped. And that's not failure. It's liberation. Because for the first time you get to choose who you want to be, without the shadow of should. The collapse of the promise isn't the end of your light. It's the end of the light that needed applause. Now the glow must come from within. Quiet, steady, intimate. It won't impress, but it will sustain. It won't make headlines, but it will build roots. This is the most brutal transition of adult symbolic life, leaving the realm of promise and entering the state of presence. Not the magical child everyone expected everything from, but the whole adult who, even without an audience, decides to keep existing in truth. The only real strategy for those who were once a promise and now feel like a burden is brutal in its simplicity. Break the pact with symbolic debt. Stop trying to repay what never should have been owed. Stop apologizing for not becoming extraordinary. This rebirth doesn't happen in public. It happens in silence. It starts when you decide to exist without proving. When you drop the mission of becoming someone and embrace the mission of simply being present, whole, imperfect. The strategy begins in the body, because that's where the promise took root. You walked tense, spoke fast, slept with guilt. Your body carried the weight of every unmet goal. The ritual now is to return to softness. Breathe without urgency. Do less. Honor small acts that once felt meaningless, because now they're real. The glow you're looking for isn't on stage. It's in the gesture, in a calm morning, in saying no without guilt, in choosing not to explain, in having the courage to exist as you are in it without a frame. Then comes the language. You need a new vocabulary. Don't say I was a failed promise, and say, I was trained to perform, but now I choose to live. Don't say I'm a burden. Say, I'm a presence in reconstruction. Language is the scaffolding of identity. Your mind needs new phrases to abandon old punishments. Create daily rituals. Rewrite self-judging sentences. Replace shame with clarity. Swap comparison for self-respect. The new strategy is symbolic, because the trauma was symbolic too. Finally comes the definitive gesture. Bury the old promise through a physical ritual. Write down the name they used to praise you, the expectations they tied to it, the future they pushed onto your back. Burn it. Watch that version dissolve. Let that emotional debt turn to smoke. This doesn't erase the past, but it reclaims the power it once had over your soul. From now on, you're no longer a failed promise. You're the self that survived the pressure of becoming something you never chose, and decided to live anyway. This is the moment. Not to win, not to prove, but to close the cycle of emotional debt. The bright child you were doesn't have to carry the shame of disappointing anyone, because they never promised anything. The world did. And now, you return that weight. You shut the symbolic account with the past. You're not a burden. You're what remains when hope turned into pressure. You're the presence that resisted collapse. And that's not just enough. It's sacred. Close your eyes. Picture the altar of old promises. See the faces that praised you, the names they used, the goals they pushed onto you. Now see yourself as a child, trying to be everything to everyone. Walk toward that child. Hold them. Whisper, you don't have to prove anything anymore, I release you. Breathe. The ritual completes when forgiveness replaces shame. Forgiveness for believing you had to earn your existence. Forgiveness for confusing love with approval. Forgiveness for being a promise, when all you needed was to be. From now on, you owe no one. Not your story, not their dreams, not the glow they projected. The new journey starts without debt, without performance, without audience. You walk not because you must arrive, but because you are already whole. The system will try to call you a failure, offer you new promises, whisper that you're falling behind. Ignore it. They only know how to value what they can exploit. And you, finally, are no longer for sale. You weren't just tired. You were misaligned. You weren't weak. You were overwriting your own code to keep someone else's promise alive. This video ends, but the dismantling begins now. The burden is not yours. It's the ghost of a role that no longer runs. Erase it. Then rebuild. Not to prove, but to exist. Leave a comment as your ritual of release. What promise are you bearing today? Share this with someone still carrying the weight of an identity they never chose. Subscribe to Rebuild in Truth, without debt, without performance. You didn't fail. You just tried to exist in a world that only claps for characters.